And we are live.
We are.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to
Hi,
the
everyone.
first lesson of the Azure Functions University. My name is Mark Duiker, and I'm happy to have a very nice co-host. Please introduce yourself.
Oh, hi, everyone. My name is Gwen Pena. Very happy to be here. Very excited to get class going, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I've been in a more or less sometimes a teaching a role or doing workshops and stuff. But this is different, right? Doing a complete lesson and hopefully many more to come over the next couple of months around this fantastic topic. So I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm really happy that you can join me, Gwen.
Well, yeah, it's a pleasure, and thank you for asking me actually to be your partner in crime here. It's a topic that we're both pretty passionate about. Maybe that might be
Yeah,
too strong of
yeah.
a word, but very interested and involved with. So yeah,
Exactly.
exciting things planned.
Cool. Okay, so let's mention what we're actually going to do this lesson and also in the lessons to come. Um, Let me share my screen as well. Okay, here we go. So the idea is that every other week we will do a lesson around a certain topic in serverless and most specific Azure functions. And this time it will be on HTTP triggers. So if you go to this link, bit.ly azfuncuni, you will be brought to this repository on GitHub, the Azure Functions University repo. And on there's a README where we describe what the plan is. So that we want to do some lessons, some live coding lessons on Azure Functions. And we also explain a bit on what serverless is, because that is has still some different definitions. Um, do you have any preferred definitions, Gwyn, about serverless?
Um, I guess the easiest one is I like the one that you put worry about servers less, but
Mm-hmm.
usually I like to say it's like server maintenance less, kind
Yeah,
of.
that's neat and very explicit in it. Yeah, I like that. I like that.
Yeah, straightforward, simple.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, indeed, yeah. And which also doesn't mean, indeed, hey, you don't have to worry about anything anymore around
Yeah.
servers or configuration or monitoring. And so that's definitely not the case. It's still very important. So there's still definitely an operations aspect there, but it's definitely way less than before. So that's definitely what I like about it. So other common aspects of serverless is the consumption model, so the pay as you go. So you only pay for it when you actually are using it, and when you're not using it, then you are not paying for it. So that's a very nice thing. Um, the automatic scaling is also a very important aspect of serverless, so you don't have to worry about scaling up front, setting limits and stuff. In a way, you can override that. You can have some control over it, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. And serverless is by nature very event driven. So a function responds on something. So a function is always triggered by something. And we're going to talk about that a lot in the next coming lessons. So it fits very well in an event driven architecture. So when we look at Azure Functions in specific, which is really where this university is about, it's Azure Functions is an event-driven serverless compute platform in the Azure cloud, and it integrates seamlessly with many other Azure services through triggers and bindings. And we'll talk about all these triggers and bindings in a lot of the lessons. So let's say that the target audience of all these lessons are definitely people who are relatively new to serverless and maybe also new to C# and .NET. Um, but if you are more experienced, there's definitely an opportunity for you, so you can help us. Do you want to explain that, Gwen?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's a few things I want to take a pause,
Sure.
but we can talk about the how to contribute part here. You actually added this somewhat recently, and I think this is a
Yeah.
fantastic idea. Like Mark mentioned, if you have already some experience, or maybe even if you're brand new, if there are any ideas or anything you'd like to see us cover, or anything you would like to, uh, provide information on, perhaps you have already something written up and you'd like to add it to the Azure Functions University repo. We have instructions exactly how to do it. I know you tested this out, I think yesterday. You
Yeah,
added
exactly.
some new.
Yeah, I already made one issue in it. Let me show it, because it's a lesson I want to prepare anyway. So when you
Great.
create a new issue, there's this issue template, which is a content request template. And when you click that, you already have a template pre-filled out for you, where we want to ask you, okay, give us a nice description of what is actually you want to add, and so make this as elaborate as you want. And then also some questions for, hey, are you actually willing to write it? So maybe you need, maybe you don't know anything about the subject, but you want to know more about it. So that's a request. But you might know a subject and you also want to help teach. So then you can indicate here if you want to help author the lesson, but also if you want to actually be part of this the live stream as well, so you can actually help with teaching the lesson as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And if you think of it from maybe you're a beginner with creating content, or you've never streamed before and you'd like to ease into it alongside like one of us or on this platform, we'd be happy to really invite anyone on, as long as it's Azure Functions related. So yeah, we our goal is definitely to community first and provide the best resources that we can. And honestly, when we were talking about what the goal was for this whole thing, when we were just getting started with the idea, it's like we're looking to create what we wish we had when we were beginning, right?
Exactly.
And there's no better way to do that than to like just get as many resources and as many beginners and experienced people helping out with this, right? So we may be sort of getting it started, but where it goes and how it develops is definitely going to be like a community effort.
Yes.
So yeah, help us out for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, that's exactly the way I see it as well, because we're starting now pretty small, and we only have this first lesson really defined and written down, and you're working on the second lesson.
Right.
But there's a lot of opportunity for other people to contribute and to join in, and we were very happy if you want to do that.
Yeah, we can. I guess the only thing we kind of have set in stone is the format, where it's like we'll write a lesson, we'll do a live stream, and then ideally we would provide some homework, which is really just a kind of like an assignment or a written up that you can get hands on with the actual knowledge that was given in the lesson and in the live stream, right? We've talked about other kind of things that we can add, but right now that's really what we want to accomplish for each lesson that we provide.
Indeed.
So besides that, any way that you would like to contribute, just definitely let us know.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, the primary focus is first people who are just getting started with serverless. So we are starting with some, let's say, easier and smaller topics, but the further we go, we can definitely welcome more advanced topics as well.
Yeah. Speaking about getting started with serverless, do you want to quickly give us the summary as to why you got into serverless and why Azure Functions specifically?
Yes. So it all happened when I was doing an assignment for my current job, my current employer. So it's slightly over 3.5 years ago, and they gave me like 5 or 6 days to complete this coding assignment. And I saw that Azure Functions was brand new, and I thought, oh yes, they want me to create some kind of a web API. I'm going to use Azure Functions for that. And in hindsight, of course, that's really not the best idea for an assessment, which is very time constrained. You're going to use a brand new technology. And indeed, that didn't work out at all. So after like 2 or 3 days, I actually gave up on using Azure Functions because I couldn't get it to work. So I was really frustrated. But so for the assessment, I fell back to just standard .NET Web API technology and forgot about Azure Functions for a couple of weeks. So I got the job. I'm still here. It all worked out very nicely. So even though I pivoted midway through the assessment, but yeah, it still stuck in my mind. This Azure Functions, it sounds so nice and so cool. So I kept digging into it and working out some samples and making some side projects. And just digging through the documentation and using Stack Overflow for a bit, but also the GitHub repos themselves, because most of what Microsoft and Azure is doing is all out in the open on GitHub. So also looking through the GitHub issues really helped me in understanding how it works. And in case I ran into an issue, then I quickly could check from, okay, maybe someone else is also having that issue, and which was often the case. So that really helped me a lot.
Cool, cool. For me, I was introduced to serverless via Azure Functions, and it was like later on in my career where I like discovered like there's Lambda, there's actual things like Logic Apps, which is I guess a flavor more like a low code no code kind of thing. I was the only cloud resource. This was at my previous role. I was the only cloud resource, and when I was given tasks, I kind of had to own those solutions end to end, and I also had like a bunch of other things to take care of. So I tried to find something that I could, develop a full solution on completely on my own. And someone had mentioned, why don't you look at Azure Functions or something like that? Because we were an Azure shop. I remember creating my first function in the portal, like in a built-in code editor, and I was just like mind blown because it's like this is a full, even though it's super simple, this is a full application right here. You just hit
you can
run
still get it done.
Yeah,
exactly.
You can get it done. And my first one was completely end-to-end done in the portal. And then later on, I like figured out visual code and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
but
right.
Ever since then, I've been hooked, and it just, for someone who doesn't have, I have more of an infrastructure background versus like an actual developer background. So for me, it was just the perfect like kind of gateway into developing more things.
Nice.
Because it's more so about figuring out how your application works versus actually like, writing a lot of code, because a lot of it's already like the templates do a lot of it for you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fast forward, here I am.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah. Quite different stories, Neat. That's also very nice of all this. I mean, because I have quite a long developer background, but you don't need to have a long developer background if you want to get started with Azure Functions, because it's really small and concise and quite okay if you want to get into development at all.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
That's also really what I like about Functions.
Cool. I think we're ready to dive in. Do we want to just show the repo, kind of how we have things structured before we dive into?
Yeah, let's do it. Yes. So we have a page where we want to have an index of all of the lessons, and they're all structured in the same way. And they also have some different callouts. So we have certain tips where we indicate how we actually do stuff and where we think it's a recommended practice. We also have some observations callouts where we really ask you to look into what you've done, and you can provide a bit more context there. And also we ask some questions at certain moments, so you would get a better understanding of what you're doing with the lesson. So right now we have 5 lessons planned. The first one is the prerequisites, which I will get into shortly. So today's lesson is a bit longer because we're first going through the prerequisites, and then we're going to talk about the HTTP trigger. So this is planned. Maybe the order will change a bit. It will depend a bit on our schedule. But let's get into the prerequisites first, and then we'll move into the actual lesson, which will be about the HTTP trigger.
Yeah, like you mentioned, today's lesson is going to be a little bit longer, but we are aiming for each one to be about an hour or so. We feel like that's a sweet spot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and you also suggested the stream is then maybe relatively long, but we actually will chop up the stream in some smaller parts, because the lessons are also structured in smaller exercises.
Right.
So the idea is we eventually we'll have one video per exercise, which is maybe like 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're gonna do our best to make this as complete as we can.
Exactly. Yeah, this is also quite new for us, so it's just a nice big experiment. Okay, the prerequisites. So yeah, if you're completely new to .NET and C#, then you might be new to some of these things. But if you want to write code in C#, then you need to have a .NET runtime and software development kit SDK installed. And we recommend you to download the .NET Core SDK 3.1. So they're working to a newer version where they dropped the core naming, and it's .NET again, but for now stick to the .NET Core 3.1. That should be good. And it works on Windows, on Mac, on Linux. So for all of the OSs, you can actually use it. So that's also the idea of all of these lessons. You shouldn't be fixed to a certain operating system. The next one is the code editor. You already briefly mentioned it, Gwyn. We're going to use VS Code for editing our functions. So although I've been using VS Code for maybe a year and a half now, I'm still used to writing code in the full Visual Studio environment. So I'm actually also learning something new because I'm now forcing myself to use VS Code. And again, VS Code runs on all platforms. It's a great editor, and especially the extension model is very nice. So when you just install it, it's quite bare bone. It doesn't do a lot, but there are really, like, I think thousands of extensions available. And one of the extensions you're going to need is a specific Azure Functions extension. Let me actually fire up VS Code so I can show you how it looks like. So this is VS Code here on the right, and if you want to install extensions, there's this extensions button here. By default, this menu bar is actually on the left. But
yeah, you have yours on the right.
I have it on the right. Yeah. So if you then search for, you'll see here that I'll make it a bit bigger. Right. Yeah. Now we have the logos as well. So this one is the one you need to install. So it's recently got to the 1.00 version. So it should be working and stable. So if you install that, I think it should also install one of the dependencies, and that's called Azure Functions Core Tools. So that actually contains the local runtime, because the idea of also the first lesson is you're not dependent of the cloud right away. So we're going to write a Azure function just locally, and we're also going to run it locally. In order to do that, we need a local development runtime. And the Azure Functions Core Tools contains that runtime, and it also contains an Azure Functions CLI, so a dedicated command line interface for Azure Functions. We're not going to use the CLI that is used under the hood by VS Code, but maybe in a later lesson we'll do a dive in that CLI, maybe when we talk about how to publish it to the cloud, for instance. Then another thing you would need is you need to have a client to actually make get and post requests to your Azure function. So a lot of people might know Postman to do that. Personally, I'm a big fan of the REST client in VS Code itself. So that's again an extension. Let me show that as well. There we go. So that's this the REST client, and yeah, you'll show in a minute how it works.
Oh, I've never used that.
Okay.
I'm excited.
Okay. We'll get there very soon. So, but this is very nice, especially because you don't have to switch then from VS Code to get another tool to test it. So you can do everything from one place, which I like a lot. So yeah, it's over 1 million installs already. So
wow,
it's going well for this one. Yeah. All right. Two of the other prerequisites I'm not going to mention right now. Well, okay, I mentioned, but not in great detail because we don't need them right away. But we will need them when we are going to work with Azure Storage, because we can actually emulate that we're using a cloud storage. So in order to work completely locally, we can use an emulator, and there are two different emulators. There's either the Azure Storage emulator, which is a Windows only one, or we can use Azure Write, which is cross-platform. But we'll dive into that in the next lesson when we talk about blob storage and table storage and queues. And finally, the Azure Storage Explorer is a tool where you can visualize your storage accounts, either emulated ones or real ones in the cloud. Okay, so that's it for the prerequisite parts. So let's set up our local workspace now. I'm gonna move this window a bit to the left So we can probably, we can still see this, right? Yeah. So on the right, I have my Windows terminal.
Wait, is that Azure Function thing in your terminal?
Yes.
How?
There's this I'm not sure if it was a post by Scott Hansman or from someone else, but you can actually, if you go to so this is a small side step, you can actually go to your settings, which is just a JSON file of your Windows terminal. And there you can define different schemas and layouts. And one of the things it allows is a background image. And it can get it from either locally, or in this case, my background image is the Azure Functions animated GIF in my GitHub repo. And you can specify how big it is, where it is aligned, if it needs to be opaque or not, and if it needs to be stretched out or not at all.
Neat. Very cool.
So you can customize it. Yeah, nice, huh? Yeah, so I have this thing running in my Windows terminal. Okay, so let's create actually a folder where we can create our function. So what we can do is the old-fashioned command line. So I'm gonna name it ABC University. Okay, so now we're in this new folder AC Funk University. I find it quite nice to work with source control, so I'm going to use init to initialize this as a new repository, but for now only locally. But I think it's useful when you have something finished, you can actually commit your changes to this local Git repository, and you can, when you make some changes and you don't like it, you can actually revert back to a working state. So that's why I'm doing this git init. So now it's this folder is under version control. Then I am also adding two more folders. One source folder where actual Azure function source will be in, and another folder where we put the files in that are used by that REST client extension, so we can actually make GET and POST requests to our local function. Okay, so now we have a function, AC Funk University, and we have two subfolders in there, source and test. So now you have your local working environment set up. So we can actually go to the next lesson, the HTTP trigger one. So I'm going to fire up code again from this folder. So now I have two instances, so I can actually get rid of one. Okay, so in VS Code, we now have this folder open with two subfolders in there, and that's it. So that's our starting situation. And then if we look at the goal of this HTTP trigger lesson now, and the goal is to first create your first function, which can be triggered by either doing a GET request or a POST request to the function endpoint. And this lesson is made up of 4 separate exercises. The first one is just creating the default function app, because they have a function app template in VS Code. So this the first step to just create that template and see if it works. It's starting to rain here, so I'm not sure if you actually hear
just
that
a little bit
through the microphone. The next exercise is actually changing that template, because the template already has quite some parameters and variables which we can change into other types of objects. Then we will change the template to also allow post requests in a different way. And finally, we're going to add another function. So we end up with 2 Azure functions, which can be used only for post requests. So yeah, if you're up to speed already and you have all the prerequisites installed, and you have this, you're looking at the same documentation from repo as I am, you can hopefully follow along. If not, you can definitely do it in your own pace later. And a completely worked out sample is also in this solution. So if you follow this link, this source code link, that will bring you to a source folder in the Azure Functions University repo. And there you have a completely worked out solution.
Yeah, we should add that for anything we sort of build or we demo, we're going to make sure we provide that code inside of the repo as well. But ideally, you'll try to figure it out on your own, and then you can look at the solution or the answer later on.
Exactly. Yeah, you'll definitely learn more if you indeed try to do it from scratch. But in some cases, it might be useful when you're stuck or something. You have something to refer to. Okay, let's start with the first exercise, and that's to create a function app. And in VS Code, you do a lot with the command palette. So it's Ctrl-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P, depending if you're on Windows or Mac. And then you can type new. And well, there's several create new options, but one of them is Azure Functions, create a new project. So let's go for that. And now you'll be guided through several wizard steps. And at the end of all these steps, the project is created for you. So we first have to define where we're going to create it. So let's browse, because I'm not doing it straight in this repository, in this folder. It needs to be a bit further down. So we want to create it in the source folder. But then I'm going to create a new folder. And that's because by default, your C# project name will be the same name as the folder you put it into. So if I would use the source folder, then my project name would also be named source.cspoj, which is not so very useful. Okay, so my folder name is azurefunctions.htp. Select it. And then it will ask me, okay, in what language do you want to create this function app? I'm going to use C# for now. If you wanted to do it in a different language, feel free to do so. I think that's also a nice area of people that can contribute, right? So because we are now focused on .NET C#, but maybe people are really fluent in JavaScript and want to provide some samples for JavaScript.
Yeah, definitely. I know someone had asked, what language are we going to be using for the lessons? Again, this is just, we're using C# like .NET just because that's our background. But again, we're looking to expand this to absolutely any of the possible options.
Yeah. All right. So the next question is select the template for this project, and that's then based on how the function will be triggered. So there are quite a lot of triggers available out of the box, but we'll choose for the HTTP trigger one. Then we can define a function name. I also scroll a bit to the left to see I'm not forgetting any steps. And we suggest, okay, use this hello world HTTP trigger as the function name. So let's do that. This, of course, can be anything you like. And finally, we have to provide a namespace for the code to live in. And a namespace is just like a logical container to structure your code in. So again, this can be anything like. I'm sticking to the Azure Functions University format. And the final question is about access rights. So how can this HTTP function be triggered? So if we choose function, you need to provide a specific function access key when your function is deployed to the cloud. When it's anonymous, you don't have to provide any key, so it's completely open. Anyone can call it. And there's also a specific key, more used for administrative purposes for the function app. But since we're developing completely locally, it doesn't really matter what you choose now. I would advise, if you don't want your function exposed, then always choose function just to be safe. Because if you choose anonymous and you publish it to the cloud, then it's completely open for everyone to call it. So now it's creating my project. So there we go. So let's see if I miss anything. No, so far so good.
Do we want to quickly summarize what we've gone through? Because we covered quite a bit here. So we got prereqs, which may seem like a lot, but once you have that all set up, you're pretty much good to go in terms of like your entire Azure Functions
Hmm.
journey, right? So, like I
Yeah,
said, it might seem like a lot to install and get going, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's kind of like a one-time thing.
True.
Now we've gone through creating an HTTP trigger Azure function. Um, Trigger is just a way of how your function is going to get executed. Remember that its functions are only, I guess, alive once they're called or they're executed by, and then the way they get executed
Yes.
is called a trigger. There's a bunch of them for Azure functions. There's Blob, Cosmos DB, Event Grid, all of these kinds of different services that you can link in. What's your favorite trigger, by the way?
Oh, that's tricky. I really like queue triggers a lot because they're very basic and really allows easy decoupling between
Hmm.
systems. So that's what I use quite a bit. But I'm also using Service Bus triggers a lot, which is more also queues but a bit more advanced.
Yeah.
So those are the two which I've been using the most lately.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right, so we created the trigger. We pretty much Visual Code helps us set up our entire Azure Function project and the actual Azure Function app without us having to necessarily try to figure out too much. It's pretty straightforward. And we've got our first function app created already. If we take a look here at the Explorer and the code, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So just by answering these 6 questions in that wizard, we now have a function app. And because the scope of function is you have a function app project, and that function app can contain several functions if you want. So if you go through the files right now, okay, so by default it adds a git ignore to ignore certain files which are actually compiled and do not belong in your Git repository. It will add this C# project file, which mentions what's the version of the SDK you're programming against. And in this case, we are writing a .NET Core app for .NET Core 3.1. So later on, if you upgrade to new versions of .NET, I'm guessing this template will also be adjusted. So then this version will probably be different. Then Azure Functions itself has different versions. So the latest and greatest version of Azure Functions is v3. But during the Azure Functions webcast earlier today, someone asked if is version 1 is still supported, because that actually doesn't work. Well, it also works with .NET Core, but it also works with .NET Full Framework, and that's also still supported. But if you're working with .NET Core, which is cross-platform, then I would highly recommend leave this on v3, because that's just the latest version that you want, and also all the new features are being done on v3. Then we see a package reference, and that references to a package made by Microsoft, and that has the Functions SDK. So that has the all of the bits and bytes of the software development kit for Azure Functions. So later on, you might take dependencies on additional packages, so you'll have more package references here. But for now, we only have this functions reference. I'll save the trigger for last. There's this host.json file. Well, that's something specific to Azure Functions. And in this host.json file, you can put in configuration, which is applied to your entire function app. So right now we only have a version of the JSON schema, and we only have some things specific for logging and application insights. But I think there was a link here as well in here. Yes, exactly. And let me open this. So you can do a lot of overrides when it comes to configuration in this host.json. So several Azure Functions extensions. For instance, we already mentioned that Service Bus is an extension on top of Azure Functions. So your function can be triggered by a message that's been placed on the Service Bus. So when you use that, you can control or configure more things specifically for Service Bus. You can also configure stuff about your health monitor. There's a very large part which you can do for logging and for different behaviors of singletons and how directories are watched. So there's a lot of overrides in configuration which you can do, but you don't need to know about this right from the very start. Only perhaps if you don't want to use the defaults, but want to get into some deeper details. All right. Then we have the local.settings.json, and that is a configuration file which is only relevant for you on your development machine. So this is also not being tracked by Git. It's actually ignored. So this is only on your local development machine, and you can use this for application settings or configurations or connection strings, which you'll only use in your local development environment.
Right, it won't get pushed to production.
Exactly.
Keep that in mind.
Exactly. Yes. All right. And the final thing that was created is our actual class, our C# class with our hello world HTTP trigger function. So we'll see that it used our namespace we provided. It uses the name of the trigger we gave. And if you look at the structure of this file, so it contains a class, but the class itself is not the function. What is the function is actually this run method. Because the run method has this attribute called function name. And the Azure Functions runtime is scanning through all these files once they're compiled and pushed to the cloud. And it will then try to find all of these methods if they have this function name attribute. So that's important to realize an Azure function in C# is just a method, and that method can have any name. It can also be ABC or foo or hi, doesn't matter at all. The only thing that matters is what's inside this function name attribute. And in this specific case, the class name and the function name are the same, but these can also be different. What I like to do is actually don't use strings as your function names, but actually use a reference to the class name. So what you do is name of and then refer to the class name. So I usually try to avoid using strings because strings can be considered, let's say, magic strings. And if you change a value in a string, some other piece in the code might not be updated that you changed that string value. So in this case, I've replaced a string value with, let's say, a more strongly typed name, which just refers to the
Look at
class.
that. Huh, the more you know. That is a fantastic tip.
Yeah, so if you just have one single function, it doesn't matter that much. But when you're working with durable functions, then this gets a bit more important, because then you're referring from one function to different functions. And yeah, if they're all strings and they don't match up, then you run into issues. So this is just a small tip. It's not always useful to use the straight string version, but use this name of keyword. Okay, so what can we see about this run method here? So it's a public static async method, and it's async because there's probably something in here. Yes, here, this method, which is also async, and async means asynchronous. So it doesn't run, or potentially doesn't run on the same thread than this code. So if you have asynchronous methods, then also your method itself should be made asynchronous. The result is a task of type iActionResult. Well, it sounds a bit abstract, but what it actually means, if we scroll a bit down, is that we will always return an OK object result. And if we dive into that OK object result, where we see that it's type of OK object, that's type of an action result, and that's then the interface we saw before, iAction result. So when we drill down like several levels, then we see that this OK object result is actually stems from the same interface as this iAction result. Okay, so how does Azure Function knows that this is an HTTP triggered function? Well, we see an HTTP triggered attribute here. So right now you're probably guessing it from, okay, a lot of things are controlled by using attributes in Azure Functions, and you're right. So if you use this HTTP trigger attribute in your method, then the Azure Functions runtime knows that you are using an HTTP trigger function. And then this first authorization level is what we supplied in the wizard. So this could also be authorization level anonymous, but in our case we selected function. So that's to indicate if we need to specify a function key when this is deployed in the cloud. Then we have several arguments which indicates how we can actually call this. And in this case, we can call this function by doing either a GET request or a POST request. But you can add and remove these. So the order also doesn't matter. So right now, when we remove the post, it will only be triggered by a GET request. If you want both, you can have it like this. And so the final argument inside this HTTP trigger, because we're now discussing these arguments inside this HTTP trigger, is the route. And by default, the route is null. And that means when we will run it, the function endpoint will be, let's say, the base URL of where you deploy it, and then /API, and then / the name of the function. But you can actually override it and put something else there. So if you use a route like this, then it will be /API /hello instead of the hello world HTTP trigger. Leave it at that. So this is the attribute, and if we do this request, then it's very likely that we want to access that request object. So here we can see that we have a request type, and here is the parameter. So we can use the rec parameter, and we see here in the function that we're actually going to use the query string of the request to try to extract a name from that query string. The final argument for this run method, because this HTTP trigger is set on this HTTP request type. We will also change this type into something else in a minute. But the final thing that's added to this run method is a logger. So you can do logging straight away when you're using Azure Functions, and you will see that right here that we will log some information that the C# trigger has been processed. So yeah, and usually in production code, you wouldn't really add this because there are other ways to find out that functions are being called and it's working. But especially when you're getting started and you are testing things and debugging things, then all these log information statements are definitely useful. So if you look into the body of this method, I already mentioned it will first try to extract a name from the query string. But then the second thing it will do, it will also try to read the body of the request, and it will deserialize it into an object. And since we don't know what the actual object is, we're using the dynamic keyword. So it could be the type of object is being determined dynamically. And then we'll assess, okay, is this name variable, did we get it from the query string? And if so, then we'll use that. But if it's null from this query string, then we'll try to get a name value from this dynamic data object. So that's what this line is doing. And then we'll create our response message, and that will depend on if the name is null or not. So if it is null, you have a message that the trigger has been executed successfully, but we didn't put in a name, either in the query string or the body. And if it is filled in, and then it will give back the hello and then the name we filled in. And it ends with always an OK object. Okay, so let's run it now. I'm pressing F5 to run it. And we'll see a couple of things below here. So it will get all of the dependencies that Azure Function uses. It will do a build of this project. And then it will see, scroll up, we'll see this func host start. So now it's starting the local development runtime. And once it's done, you'll have a list of all the functions it finds. In this case, it has found one function, our HTTP trigger. We'll see how we can invoke it by either a get or a post, and we see the URL. And now it's just waiting. And because we actually need to do something, we need to invoke it. So let's do that. So I'm copy pasting this link. And I'm going to our test folder, and I'm creating a new file here. I'm calling it local.http. And it doesn't matter what kind of name you give it, but the .http part matters. It should be either named .http or .rest, because we are going to use the REST client extension from Azure Functions. So now we can actually write how to call our function. So we're going to do a GET request to this endpoint. And you'll see that something appeared here. There's this link now, which is actually a button. So we can actually now do this request. And before we do that, let's put in a breakpoint. Let's put it right here. So when we invoke the message, the execution will stop here at this breakpoint, and we can actually detect and see what happens when we call it. So let's do it. So we can also see here that this function is now being executed. Yeah, it's being executed. And we see that the breakpoint has been hit. So we have successfully triggered this function. So it will log something, and you will also see it back here. So the log message is being put out here in this terminal. But now it's going to check if it's something is available in this query string, and we didn't provide a query string. So this will be null. Okay, and we also didn't provide anything in the body. So it will also be null. So the message will be that this has been successful, but we didn't pass in a name in the query string or whatever. Okay, so we've actually successfully executed our function. But now let's change it a bit to actually give it a query string with something. Okay, so now we did provide a name in the query string. Let me remove this breakpoint and run it again. Okay, so now it worked.
Neat. That's neat how that works, that extension. I love that it's right inside of Visual Code.
It's really super nice. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first one. But we can also do a post. So let's also do a post. So if you want to have multiple requests in one file, you have to use 3 of these hashtag characters. And you can make another request. And, the endpoint. If you do a post, you have to put something in the body, and you then need to provide a header, which has the content type, in this case, application JSON. Then make sure you leave one line empty, and then provide the JSON. Oh, that lost. So let's run this. Okay, so the post also works. Excellent. Okay, let's stop the execution of the function. And let's move back to our lesson. So we've actually started it. We've seen that it mentions the HTTP endpoint in the output underneath here. We made a GET request, and we also did a POST request actually, and we saw that it gave back the expected results. So far so good. So we can move on to the next exercise, and we can then change the template to only allow GET requests.
Keep in mind that we haven't changed any code at all. This is just using the template that's generated by Visual Code.
Exactly. Yeah, that's actually a good point, because this is now the generated code. But let me actually commit this, because this is in a working state. So okay, so I committed that to my local repository. So in case I make a big mistake, I can always go back. All right. So now let's change the template what we have and change it into something different. So if we only want to have it triggered by GET request, then we should remove this post. And again, I said before that I don't like all these string values here and there. So in this case, you can also get rid of this GET string by again using remove. And then use something called HTTP methods, and which has all of the different HTTP verbs in there. Okay. So this is exactly the same, and just using GET in quotes. All right. Let me make the screen bigger again. So another thing we can do is, instead of using the HTTP request, you can also use different types there. So you can use this HTTP request, but there's also a different type. It's called HTTP request message. And if you just read quickly, that means it did not recognize this type yet, and that's because it lives in a different namespace. So it lives in a different structure of code that we need to take a dependency on. It actually knows that we need to refer to system.net.http. So let's add a using, and that means that this bit. So we are now dependent on code which lives in this namespace. Okay, so we're using a different type here now, HTTP request and message.
Can you explain the difference?
Well, I'm about to, yes. So these two types, okay, I'll switch back to HTTP request. So this type, HTTP request, when we dive into it, that has certain methods. You can get to the query string, you can get to the body as a stream. Okay, you can inspect different things of the headers or the content type, blah, blah. We used this one, the query, to get to the query string. And I think we use this body by reading it from a stream. But this HTTP request message has different type, and also then different properties. And for some properties, it makes certain things easier, and for some properties, it makes different things maybe a bit harder. I especially like it because of the content part. So we won't see it in this exercise, but in the next exercise, when we actually do posts, and we're going to expect the content, because it has some very nice ways to actually immediately deserialize your body into a C# object without doing readings from streams and
Cool.
serializing yourself. So yeah, it's just a different representation of the same thing. And yeah, sometimes it's useful to take a different route to go to a certain result. So we see some red squigglies now because this query property is not available anymore because we have this different type. So what we do have is a collection request and go to the request URI and part of the URI is then the query string, and there is a method to actually parse that query string. And the result is then a name value collection. So it's more or less the same what we had before, because we also there had a name value collection, or that was a query collection. So in this collection, you can then access the individual elements of the query string collection by the keys again. So compared to the HTTP request, using this HTTP request message is a bit more work, right? So the other one was definitely more easier for GET request. This is actually a bit more easier for POST request, but we'll get to that. Since this function will only deal with GET for now, let's get rid of this completely. Okay, so so what I would like is that instead of always passing back an OK object result, that I want to receive a bad request message when I don't provide the name, because I think that's more sensible than always return a 200 OK message.
Mm-hmm.
So if so, I want to check if the name is nil. If the name is empty, then I want to return add request object result. And it also needs to be a text in here, so please provide a query string. Right. And if the name is not empty, then we can return a new object result. Okay. So to me, functionally, this makes more sense. So if something is not there, then we let the user know from, okay, something failed, so please provide it and make a better request. Otherwise, the request is fine, and we return something like we did before, hello, and the name. That's it. It's a bit of a different way of making sure when you're working with HTTP triggers and web APIs, so everything HTTP based, make sure you're very explicit and use standards in the way how you communicate things. Yeah, so don't always give back an OK object result if something is not okay.
Right. See, and these are the best lesson. Practices that you get as you go, kind of. But when you're getting started, you wouldn't know. So this is great. Yeah. This is fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, so there's still an orange squiggly here. So this method was an asynchronous method because previously there was some asynchronous code in there that is not available anymore. So we can actually get rid of this. And if you have asynchronous methods, your response is always wrapped in a task. So we can also get rid of that. So now we have a normal static method, which is not asynchronous anymore. So let's see if this runs. So let's build it. So note what we have changed is we changed this type from a request message to from HTTP request to request message, and we changed the body of the method itself. But we did not change the function name or anything much in the HTTP trigger. Okay, we removed the post, but the get is still available and the route is still available. So our endpoint is actually still the same. So let's put a breakpoint in here. And let's call our function again. Let's do this get request. Okay, and indeed, we now have our Azure Functions University from this new GET request. So that's fine. So it actually should end up in this to return OK object. Okay, perfect. So we have a 200 OK. Excellent. But now when we do not provide the name, so if we leave this out completely, then we should not get an OK object back. So this is now null empty. So it should go into this if statement. Yep. And now we get a bad request. Cool. All right. So that seems to be working. Okay. So let's move on. We've done this. We are using a different type. We now have a bit more logic to return a bad request object or an OK object. Yeah, and we tested it. Perfect. So now let's include the handling of post requests again. So the default example worked with a dynamic data object. So we didn't know what the type was. So we were trying to get something out of it and have the framework figure out what kind of type it is. But in my opinion, it's always best if you actually do know what type it is, because then you can actually take advantage of using the type and using the properties of the type. So I suggest we add a new class file to our function. So let's call it person.cs. And I'm actually going to copy this code block, which we have in the lesson. So we're putting a new code block, a new class called person with a property name inside the namespace we were already using, the Azure Functions University demo. So now we have this object, and we actually refer to this object in our function. Let's actually first make sure that our function can be triggered again by doing a post. So I'm going to add this, I'm going to copy this to a post. So another function is triggered both the get and the post again. But now I want to handle also the case that we want to extract the body, and we expect a person data in that body. So what you can do there is go to the request, and you can go to the content of the request. Some very nice read methods. That's what I was mentioning before. If you use the HTTP message, HTTP request message type, you have all these nice methods available. So I'm going to use this read as async. So here we can actually refer to our person object. And it's an asynchronous, so we actually await it. And it's now read quickly because this method is synchronous. So also our method that wraps it should be asynchronous again. So let's change it all the way back as we had before. Now everything is good. So what we have in this one line is we can immediately extract a .NET type of type person straight from the content of our request. And this is a bit of an easier way than actually the default template had when it was using the HTTP message HTTP request itself, because that was dealing with a stream and then an explicit deserialization. But this will actually do the deserialization for you. So you have a little bit less code to worry about. To get to the name then, so the name is actually a property of person. So now we have extracted the name from the content. One thing which still bugs me now is we run it both for a GET request and for a POST request. and that doesn't sound really good. So I either want to execute this code for a GET request, or I want to execute this code for a POST request. So we can actually inspect the request method and build in some logic for that. So if you do request, look at the method, and then inside the method there's another property called method. So this looks a bit weird because method.method.
Yeah.
But if that's equal to an HTTP methods get, then we want to execute this. And else if just call it post. This. We expected a few bits now, because we define name here and we're referring to it here, but name is not yet known in this scope. So let's define name here. A default value, which should be null. Okay. So what happens? We can actually check here what type of request we are receiving. So if we are receiving a GET request, then we're going to check the request URI and get it from the query string. If the method is a POST, then we're going to read it from the body. So that's what's happening here. I could also do this else, and don't check explicitly for a POST. But what if people then add, okay, I want to I'm going to trigger it for a delete, for instance, or because there are more HTTP verbs you can work with. I mean, get and post are probably the most commonly used ones, but there are more verbs. So that's why I'm being very explicit and want to check if the method is post, then I'm reading it from the content. Okay, so now our method handles both situations. So let's run it. So the only thing which changed is that we can also trigger it now by doing a post request. So we'll see that again here. And we have the post request here, but the endpoint is still the same. Okay, so let's do this post now. There was still a breakpoint set, which is fine. And we see Azure Functions University from body. So that actually worked. I'll remove this breakpoint now. Okay, so we get a 200 okay. So that's working. All right. There is then still another exercise. So this is all working now with this new request type, but we can even simplify it even more. Because I think that's the goal, right? We want to write as little as code as possible, because all code you write can contain bugs and you need to test it. And I heard quite often that code, you should see code as a liability. So, and I think that's a good view at it. So even though I really like writing code, you should always strive to write as little code as possible, but not so little that it becomes like unreadable and very cryptic. No, it should be still very descriptive. So that's why I like sometimes long variable names and long method names and long class names. So it should be very clear. So the intent of your code should be very clear. But yeah, if you have an option to write, let's say 50 lines or 500 lines to do the same thing, yeah, then please go for the route to write 50 lines.
So where the function is at right now, it's pretty much the same end result, but it's including best practices that you've learned along the way, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because I would only execute code if it's really relevant. So that's why I put in the check of check what the method is. And I want to return a appropriate result to whatever client is calling this code to make sure that they can respond in a proper manner.
Okay, cool. All right.
All right, so let's go to the final exercise. I'm actually going to create a new function. I'm going to actually create a straight copy of the one we already have. So let's do it. Copy paste this. I'm going to call this person type trigger. So I will. So I'm in this new class now. We see some red squigglies here because there are now two files, but they have the same name. So we should also be called person type trigger. So now we have something interesting. So I renamed the file, I renamed the class, but I did not rename the function name itself. So what happens now if I try to run or build the function app? Shall we try that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be some kind of error, but let's see.
Exactly. Yes. So it says, okay, what it says, yes, here. This is the most important thing. Each function must have a unique name. So inside your function app, it's definitely possible to have multiple functions. That's definitely advisable, but each function should have a unique name. And this is the part that's important. So whatever is inside this function name. To make sure that you always have unique function names inside your function app. All right. So this final exercise is only about doing post request to an endpoint. So I'm going to remove this get. So it only allows post. I'm also going to remove this. We're not going to use an HTTP request message, but we're going straight for the person type. So that means any code working with request doesn't work anymore. So goodbye. Let's get rid of all this. String. That's all what we have left now.
Wow, that's got simplified a lot.
Exactly. So we are not
just by changing that.
Yeah. So we're not doing a lot anymore. So there's also no async code anymore. So we can actually get
Right.
rid of this again. Right. So it's now a very basic method, only triggered by a post.
Mhm.
We use this person type straight away as our input type, and we access the name property from there. And then depending on if it's filled or not, we get the result back. Let's see if this works. It's now building. Yeah, it's starting the local runtime, so the build has succeeded. And we will now also see two endpoints. So this was the endpoint of the previous exercise, and this is the new endpoint of this exercise. So let's copy this one. And let's use hashtags again. And only call this via a post. Specify the content type again. And we have to make sure we provide a link. Okay, so let's run this. And that works. So I really like this. So we actually started out with a relatively large, let's say, default function.
Right.
Then went to changing some different parameters and adding some logic. But eventually, when you're only interested in post requests, then you can actually simplify it even further by using a straight .NET type as the input argument. So you can actually reduce the code you add.
It makes it easy to just kind of go straight into something that you can work with, like an object.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's like I guess the goal with functions is also you don't really want one massive function to take care of all your things you're doing. The more you can like
Yeah.
break them apart and make them what's the word? Like so they just do exactly what they need to do and nothing more.
Yeah, they should have just
That's the
one,
goal.
the single responsibility principle, so to say. Exactly. Yeah, it should do one
Yep.
thing really well, and that also makes your code probably easier to test. So definitely, yeah. So I would also advise from, yeah, it's probably don't probably make separate functions if you have these different HTTP verbs you want to use. So you can indeed use this as an advantage. Because otherwise, you'll see your function will become larger and larger with more if statements and more different conditions to test. So I definitely recommend it to keep them as small and simple as possible.
Wow, fantastic. I learned a lot. A lot of best practices in this session today. It's
Cool,
fantastic.
cool, excellent. Okay, we didn't address the route part yet.
Right.
Shall we still do that? Because there's not really an exercise for, but I if we have some time, I can still do it.
Yeah, we'll take a few minutes of doing it.
Yeah, let's do it. Let me actually go back to. Let me actually create a copy of this existing. One. Well, let's call this the custom greeting HTTP trigger. Cancel that. Okay. So again, I have a new name, so I should change the class name and I should change the function name. So good. So what we can do with this route is, let's say the basis should be the same. So normally if the route is null, the route will be /API/custom greeting HTTP trigger. So let's say we still want to use that. But let's say we also want to introduce an optional parameter in that route, greeting, and we can make it optional by putting in a question mark here. So now the route is custom API/custom greeting HTTP trigger / and then something which we need to fill in the URL soon. But in order for us to access it in our code, we also need to make it available here. So we do string. Okay. So the idea is that instead of saying hello all time for the greeting, we can also change this to hi or good day or whatever. So that's a custom greeting part. So since we defined this in our route now, this is greeting, and we've defined it as a separate, let's say, input argument, we can now use it in our code here as well. So instead of hello, we can actually refer to greeting. But mind you, this thing is optional. So we should actually check if it's null. So greeting should be greeting, but if it's null, we should default then to hello. Let's do that. Okay, so now let's try this. So now we have yet another function. So you see, difficulty selecting it now. Okay, so let's go back to. No, that's not the one. This is the one. Let's do a get to this endpoint. We will specify a name as well. So, and this greeting will change to to high. So now we expect the result of high AC Func Uni. Yep, that works as well.
It works.
Cool stuff. And since it's optional, and get rid of this. And now you should get hello Azure Function Uni. Yep. Perfect.
Boom. Cool.
Right. Okay. So yeah, we have seen quite a lot of variation now in how to actually trigger HTTP triggered functions. I think we covered a lot.
Yeah, that was I definitely learned a lot.
Cool.
We got through the entire lesson. I know there's some stuff at the bottom that are kind of like extra resources on the homework part.
Yeah. Exactly. Shall I click through this and you can elaborate on this?
Yeah, of course. To be fair, this is an idea we came up with, I think, yesterday
Yeah.
afternoon. So
Yeah.
I kind of just rushed to put something together. But the goal is to have something. So you'll go through a lesson, you'll go through the actual lesson instructions, but then having an actual hands-on activity to do. So I really like this resume API idea that my friend Rishabh came up with. His tutorial is the second link under the resources part. It's in JavaScript, but again, Azure Functions will work with a bunch of different flavors, programming languages, and such. So I think it's a cool and a neat idea, and it's all just an HTTP trigger, Azure Function, and it's a really great getting started project. So I also built a super simple one. I've provided there some resources, and the actual solution you can find in here too. And it's in here if you like, very simple. But yeah, and then you can take it as make it as complex as you'd like, include more information. I know there's like a JSON resume schema out there that you can follow to, the possibilities are endless, but I think it's a great
very good,
hands-on.
exactly. A very good starter exercise, homework exercise, indeed, because you can make it very small, like a tiny response, or put as much in there as you want, or make it configurable. You can go totally crazy.
Yeah, and the goal is to, again, provide, we were talking about this before too, is like, we don't know if you want to build like an application that we continuously build on each lesson, or we just provide these small kind of hands-on examples. I guess we'll see as we go. Also, if anyone wants to contribute project ideas, homework assignment ideas, that would be fantastic as well. And you can share your solutions with us on, Twitter, LinkedIn. Just use that hashtag Azure Functions University. And tag us. We'd love to see it. And if we get any submissions, we'll highlight them on the next stream. And maybe if there's, I don't know, specific questions about it, we could go over them just for a little bit of time in the next stream or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, we definitely want it to be like, we want Azure Functions University to be like kind of like your one-stop shop to just get all the knowledge you need to get going, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we made a nice start with the HTTP one right now. So I hope we can do many more of these. But we definitely need your help. So please make some new requests for content, what you would like to see. And also please indicate if you want to make the content yourself, or know someone else who might be interested. So please have everyone point to this repo.
Yeah. Do we want to announce the next date? Next lesson date?
Yeah, so the idea is to do this every other week on a Wednesday,
Right.
because I think that works best for us.
Same time.
Exactly the same time, so it'll always be on a Wednesday, always on the same time. And perhaps we will exchange some hosts now and then, depending on the topic, or people have contributed to lessons. And it's maybe depending also on our availability, because you will be moving soon as well. So maybe sometimes we will not both be there, but that's okay.
Yeah, we're gonna try to be consistent with the like bi-weekly schedule. If it's not Mark and myself, might be like a different combo. But we're committed to keeping this going and involving the community, right?
Exactly.
That was great. I learned a lot. I hope people in the who are watching learned as well.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I saw an reference to the JSON resume schema in the chat. Yeah, that's definitely interesting to look at as well. So there is
Yeah, if you
already an
could
existing
implement
schema
that.
for resumes or for CVs. Yeah,
Yep.
but feel free to experiment and do whatever you want in whatever format you want. It's just a nice programming exercise for you.
Yep. Definitely.
Okay. Any final bits?
Follow us on Twitter if you have any questions. Just we're always on there. Maybe a little bit too much, but
Definitely too much.
but yeah, we'd be happy to
Yeah.
answer any questions or
Exactly.
find a way.
If you have questions, just mention us, just ping us, and we'll do our best, Anita. And yeah, we'd like to see you in 2 weeks at the next lesson.
Yeah.
Okay.
See you next week. Oh no, 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
All right. Bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.